Hey guys, welcome back to the Got Fishing Podcast. We have probably our most unique show that we have ever had. I'm really excited to introduce our guests. But just remember, at the end of this, please share it and definitely subscribe. So, our guest today is Andrew Tsui. And I met Andrew probably about a month and a half ago just through an introduction. And we were on the phone, actually on a video conference, much like this. And he started telling me a little bit about Ike Jime. And I'm going to hand this right over to Andrew because most of you probably have not heard of Ike Jime. But I think you're going to find as we have this discussion, this is extremely interesting stuff. It does apply to all of us at some level, especially us anglers, but really everybody that's out there consuming fish. So, Andrew, welcome to the show. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Pleasure to be here today,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
I hope I can do some justice to demystifying this term. So,
Well, let's just get right to it. In your own words, because I'll just mess it up. Tell us what is EKG.
so literally, ikejime is a Japanese term to describe. Um, Transliterally, it is the word to live kill. So it means to literally render a live animal no longer live. So it's the the act of killing. Um, but it's more specifically the act of killing for the sake of the food quality. So it's not just sort of wanton murder. It's the act of killing in order to optimize the eating quality of something.
Like
So
honoring and preserving?
yeah, I think that it's easy to apply like a philosophical approach to it, but I think it's also just very practical because behind Ikejime are a variety of scientific principles that we understand, um, even here in the United States. And maybe we'll talk about it later. We regulate in the United States, um, but we tend to overlook fish as something that's worthy of that consideration, worthy of that live killing in order to optimize the eating quality. So, my company, the Ike Jime Federation, I sort of refer to this as a considered kill. It's considered because you're doing it for a specific purpose. It's not you're not considering um, the religious significance. You're not considering much else. It's the consideration of a live kill in order to optimize the eating quality and also the shelf stability of it. So if you will kill, I mean if you will eat, then this is the way to kill it.
And this is primarily with fish, correct?
Correct. Correct. And I think maybe part of the reason that we don't really have a word for killing fish is because historically and traditionally we don't actively kill fish. So we will passively allow a fish to die, but we don't really have a process to kill it. Um, and to the extent people may use some practice, so maybe some folks will bonk it, or maybe some folks will, I don't know, quote unquote, bleed it out, or have some other way of that. It's not always backed up by science. It's more anecdote. It's more, well, this is the way my grandfather did it, or this is the way I like to do it. But one of the things that's very compelling about Ikejime is that it is not anecdotal. It is supported by peer-reviewed research. It's supported by industry. And if anyone is confused, and we'll talk a little bit about this probably in greater detail later, it is what has given rise to the most dominant premium seafood economy on the planet, and that is Japan's. Um, Ikejime is largely the sole source of why this tiny island archipelago has managed to command the most premium seafood prices on Earth.
So real
And so,
quick,
mhm,
talk our audience through so they can envision this a little bit. Let's just kind of dummy this down a little bit and bring them to the art of the harvest. Like what is happening here?
sure. So, well, maybe I'll just walk you through like the parts of Ike Jime first, and then we can talk about why each step is important.
Yeah.
So the Ike Jime is a series of handling techniques and skills. And it's not a random series, it's a sequence of events. So it begins with a brain spike. Um, and
So
so a
you
lot
bring the
of,
fish in, you've caught the fish now, brought it to the boat, and it's time
right,
to, instead of throw it in the live well, to expire the way it's done today in so many ways. This is
mhm,
bringing it to the boat and then taking it through this process that you're explaining now.
correct, yeah, as soon as possible, you want to uh, stop the fish's ability to experience stress. So the most fundamental aspect is that you don't want it to stress. And the reason is because stress has a variety of known biochemical, biophysical, and hormonal consequences. So when a fish stresses, it will release cortisol into its bloodstream and lactic acid into its muscle tissue and adrenaline. When a fish has never really felt gravity before. And so when it comes on land or it comes onto the deck of a boat, it's going to feel its own body weight for the first time. And it's going to stress. Fish hasn't really experienced unfiltered light before. So it's going to actually be blinded because fish's pupils cannot regulate. They're always their pupils don't dilate and contract. So it's going to stress, and that stress is going to have measurable consequences for the quality of the resulting muscle tissue if it continues to be exposed to that stress. And that's especially true if it suffocates to death. So the first step of Ike Jime is to eliminate or at least try to minimize the amount of stress that that fish can experience in the first place. So that's step one. That's priority number one, is to immediately dispatch it. And so Ike Jime uses a brain spike, um, and it does not mean that you cannot use percussive stunning methods like a bat or a rock or some other blunt instrument. There's nothing wrong with that. It just tends to be a little bit more efficient and easy to have a small spike rather than to swing a bat around in a small space and
Right.
maybe there's fiberglass
Right.
surfaces around or maybe even loved ones. And you're aiming for a small target. So a um, a brain spike is just sort of a quick and easy solution to killing the fish immediately. The second step is to exsanguinate the fish or bleed it. And this is important because the lion's share of a fish's bacterial load is in the gut cavity, but also there's a lot of bacteria on its skin and there's some in its blood. But blood is the most nutrient dense sort of resource in a fish's body for bacteria to start to colonize, and it's also distributed through its vascular system. So if you don't exsanguinate or bleed the fish, then over time the bacteria are going to have a very, very fun time of decomposing that fish from the inside out. So exsanguinating is critically important, and the reason you do it after the brain spike is because the heart will continue to beat for some time even though it's brain dead. And so if you can actually make an incision to let the blood flow out, the residual blood pressure in the heart will actually naturally pump the blood out of the body.
Hmm.
And people ask me a lot, like, well, how long? It depends on the species, it depends on the size, and it depends on whether it's farmed or wild. So a tuna's heart can actually beat for a solid half an hour after it's been killed. By contrast, you know, trout don't go that long. Farmed salmonids like Atlantic salmon or whatever, they don't go that long. They're not really bred to, and they're not that robust. But the heart will continue to beat. So you want to use that window of opportunity to let the residual blood pressure pump as much blood out as possible. The third step of Ike Jime is one of the most mysterious steps that people don't understand, but I encourage folks to really try to drill down and understand why, because that is possibly one of the most significant reasons that the Japanese seafood industry has managed to claim this dominance. And it's the control of rigor mortis. And so I think a lot of anglers have experienced fish in rigor mortis,
Yeah.
and they can't really articulate what its significance is, but also why it's so significant from a food quality perspective. So I'll just talk really quickly about rigor mortis, why it happens, and then I'll talk about what the Ike Jime approach is to managing it. So rigor mortis is the natural stiffening of the muscle fibers, and that's going to occur in a dead fish. It's going to occur in a dead chicken, and it's going to occur for everyone on this podcast at some point. And it begins at the moment that cellular energy is entirely exhausted. So cellular energy gets exhausted because you're not producing oxygen anymore, and that's because you're not breathing. But if you use up your oxygen very quickly and you use up your cellular energy very quickly, especially because you're suffocating and you're thrashing and you're trying to escape and you're trying to breathe, you will exhaust all of your cellular energy very quickly. And of course, that's the moment at which rigor mortis begins. Rigor mortis is actually a very hard process on the muscles. So the stiffening of the muscles is actually doing some, excuse me, it's doing some, it's tough. It's a tough natural process. What you tend to see is folks will, take a fish out of their, I guess maybe you guys might use creel baskets, or they'll take it out of the cooler and it's curled up into the shape of a C. But then there's this defensive rush to fillet that fish. And so what you'll see folks do is they'll grab the tail, they'll grab the head, and they'll force it down flat. And what's actually happening when you apply that force is you're shattering effectively a matrix, and it's a stiffened matrix. And you're creating intracellular tearing in the muscle tissue. And of course, if that fish is not bled, now you've created more surface area for the bacteria to colonize. And you've exposed a great deal of muscle tissue and surface area to oxygen and yeast and bacteria and water and all kinds of stuff. So rigor mortis is known in the scientific community as having very measurable consequences on muscle tissue, not just for fish, but for beef and for pork and for chicken. And these things are very well studied in sort of the annals of animal husbandry and slaughter. So, and I should mention also muscle tissue that is highly acidic because it's been stressed, that goes into rigor, is also very compromised. And they've studied that not only as fresh products, but also post-freezing. So the thawing of meat that's highly acidic, but then also goes through a very rapid rigor sequence is very compromised meat. That's not meat that you see very often because it's, of course, illegal to do that. So one of the ways to try to stop the fish from going into rigor very quickly is to say, well, not only are you dead, but you will be paralyzed. The fish is paralyzed. And the reason that paralysis is important is because most animals will continue to move even after they're brain dead. So as like a lot of hunters know, and maybe, folks in the meat industry or, unfortunately, people in forensics, the muscle movement does not simply stop once something is dead. So if you cut a chicken's head off, it'll still run for a little while. And that's because there's still residual electrochemical signals in the spinal cord. And so if that electrochemical energy remains in the spinal cord, it will still cause the muscles to fire. That's why the chicken may still run.
Mm-hmm.
At a cellular level, it will continue to fire even if you can't detect it with your naked eye. And that will exhaust the muscle tissues. And again, at the point at which the cellular energy is gone, it goes into rigor. But what happens if you rupture the spinal cord? In other words, if you prevent the spinal cord, even residual electrochemical signaling, from even being able to fire the muscle tissue at all. And that process is called Ike Jime. So Ike Jime sort of broadly includes this spinal pithing, which is the rupturing of the spinal cord so as to paralyze even a dead animal. There is an analog for that in beef and pork processing. It's called spinal pithing. It's oftentimes used as a defensive measure to make sure that even the dead cow cannot kick the handler post-mortem. So it's a sort of an OSHA requirement. But yeah, so the spinal pithing, the Ike Jime, is sort of the third step of Ike Jime. The fourth step is critically important, not as exotic, but also a little bit foreign to a lot of American fishermen and anglers. And that's the use of a slurry. So typically, folks will, take fish and then just throw it on a bed of ice in their cooler. It will suffocate to death. It will not be bled, and then it'll just sort of sit in a kind of refrigerated box. But the ice is effectively gravel, so it's like a gravel bed. Hot air rises. So if the fish is on top of the ice, it's in the hottest part of the cooler. And then if the fish is like on its side, only one side is getting cooled.
Right.
So the slurry is a way to actually create an immersion chill, and it's a rapid immersion chill. And so a slurry is roughly 1-to-1 parts water and ice. And it's the opportunity to actually completely submerge the carcass into a slurry so that the entire body of the fish is enveloped in this change of temperature comprehensively and evenly. And that will bring the core body temperature down very quickly. It will also inhibit the proliferation of bacteria, and it will also actually have great effects in controlling the temperature during rigor mortis, which is really important, but I'm not going to get into that mumbo jumbo right now. So it's 4 steps. So it's an immediate brain spike. It is the exsanguination protocol. It is the spinal pithing or paralysis protocol. And then it is the rapid chilling of the carcass comprehensively and evenly. And that effectively is creating a pristine muscle protein. You're optimizing the muscle quality by eliminating the biochemical risk, by minimizing the biophysical consequences of death, and also by minimizing the hormonal consequences of a suffocation sequence. So this is how you sort of create a world-class quality eating product from a live animal. And a lot of folks, in the US, we have very immature language for how we describe quality fish or seafood. And the offending word is fresh. Fresh, I tell people, does not tell the whole story. The fish can be biochemically, biophysically, and hormonally compromised before it reaches land. It can be so stressed that you will never redeem the quality of that fish. I don't care how fresh it is. So quality in my world is not a function of the recency of death, but instead the manner of death. It is how the animal was cared for at the point of death. And that's Ike Jime in a nutshell. We done? Sorry.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Pretty simple. Yeah. Pretty simple. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's just like in general, like I want folks to understand why they're doing things. I don't want folks to just sort of randomly, do these seemingly macabre things to a fish without understanding why, and also why it's actually very common for us to do this, just not on fish. It's legal. It's a legal requirement in the United States for livestock. It is enforceable by the USDA's FSIS agency. So we know how to do this. We have known how to do this for a long time. It's just that culturally we don't consider fish as having some sort of either economic or cultural value that merits a more considered process. And so that's what my goal is as with the Ike Jime Federation.
So really, for the listeners, and we'll talk about the USDA and like you were mentioning, the restrictions that beef and pork have to go through that fish obviously don't here in the U.S. But I want to bring us back to a little bit of the techniques that are used real quick for the listeners. I mean, obviously, this is a way of harvesting your fish and keeping it in its purest form, and making sure that you really have the tastiest possible fish without all of the bacteria and a lot of the things that can occur. Obviously, most people have been eating fish forever, and the majority of the fish that they've been eating have not been harvested in this way. So this idea that it's really bad for me, I don't know how much that really hits people. Although I don't think we really understand the detriments of all the mercury that we have in salmon. And as you and I discussed last time, that's not just in salmon, but in the majority of the fish that we're eating that out of the ocean. But really, this is also a way of when you're out there fishing and you are catching and keeping, whether that, for the people here in the United States, salmon and obviously some trout. This is a way of making sure, just like we do here when we hunt, we want to make sure that we get the hide off the animal. We want to make sure that we get it quartered out. And the reason that we're doing that is to make sure that this animal that we're going to be eating is in the best form possible. It's going to be the tastiest product that we can have. And so really that's in essence what is happening here is really making sure that the animal that you've caught and kept is being, preserved in the most purest manner possible. And really, it's not really changing too many things up because most people do, like you said, if you're keeping a fish, club it, or, back in the old days when you're on the shore, you'd hit it over a rock. So people are, exterminating their fish. They are usually typically thrown in a cooler. And this is a way of just doing it differently. And obviously there's some real reasons why you would want to do it.
Yeah, well, let's go there because maybe this is like the more interesting part of what Ike Jime offers. So, yes, you are left with a superior quality protein. But maybe we can talk about what the significance of having a superior quality protein is.
Absolutely.
So, um, I know you're a hunter, and I know that you probably are very familiar, as are your contemporaries, with the idea of hanging meat, right?
Sure.
So you need to hang it. Hanging is also an industry term, and it is the duration of time during which the meat needs to go through rigor mortis. So if it's too early, if you, let's say you killed an elk, you quartered it out in the field, and you tried to cook it right there. You tried to bite it right there. It does not have either the texture that's appropriate for you to chew, and it will not have the flavor either. So why is that? Right? It will taste like a bundle of rubber bands. It has not softened, right? So that's because it needs to go through rigor and it needs to resolve from rigor, and that is the period of hanging. So the question is, why can it hang before and have that time and not decompose? And why is it that fish will decompose before they can go through rigor and hang? So the word for like very, very premature meat is green meat. So green beef or green pork means it hasn't gone through that hanging process. And, you know, just fun fact, in the United States, it's illegal to sell beef that is younger than 2 weeks.
Hmm.
So it does need to go through this natural hanging process.
For a minimum of 2 weeks.
A minimum. Yeah, it may not hit the market for 2 weeks. So the question is like, what's happening during that time? So when an animal goes through rigor mortis, it will eventually soften, right? So the question is, what's happening when the meat is softening? And the answer is, it's going through a natural enzymatic process. So rigor mortis will never, you can never once the muscle fibers stiffen, they cannot not stiffen. They can't relax. And they cannot relax because there's no more oxygen being produced because it's dead. The only way that any animal resolves from rigor mortis is actually a structural breakdown of the muscle tissue itself. So it's intracellular fibers that are being softened because the enzymes are actually breaking those down and it's softening the muscle tissue. And that's what we're experiencing when we see like the rigor mortis resolving.
Right. Okay.
But what's really fascinating about that is that the enzymes that are breaking down the meat are actually metabolizing that meat. And the byproducts of that metabolic process are amino acids, new amino acids. And so that overall enzymatic process is called autolysis. So we want this autolytic process to occur because one of the primary amino acids that's being created is glutamic acid and isinus. God, I'm gonna mess this up. Isinusaic acid. Isinusaic acid and glutamic acid. So these particular amino acids are what's responsible. Excuse me. These particular amino acids are what's responsible for the savory taste. That's the umami. So you're not going to get umami if you field dress an elk and try to bite it or cook it. It's going to taste very, very bland, and it's going to be really difficult to chew. You get that rich, savory flavor because you've allowed the animal's carcass to go through this natural autolytic process to create those glutamic acids naturally. So foods that are high in glutamic acid are things like tomatoes and cheese and wine and beef and sausage and mushrooms. These are foods that are high in glutamic acid. And fun fact, if you add a salt to glutamic acid, you get a glutamate. If you synthesize glutamate, you have monosodium glutamate. And now you've got a Dorito. So that savory flavor that we naturally get from beef and other animal proteins is achievable, especially in large protein cuts, by this natural autolytic process.
And that's why
What's
some
happening?
steakhouses will tout that they dry age theirs for X amount of time, 60 days, 90 days. And in
That's
theory, it's
exactly
making it more savory.
that is exactly what's happening, and it's making it more tender. So the dry aging process is the tenderization and the enhancement of the glutamic acid content in that cut of steak. And they have to trim the pellicle off of that, right? So the exterior of the meat will actually have like a lot of bacteria and yeast and grossness on the outside. You trim it off, but what's left on the interior core is luxury, right? It's just incredible flavor. So that process is something that Americans really haven't had an opportunity to experience with fish. And I would argue that's because we tend to eat fish and seafood very defensively. And we should because it's rotting. and it's rotting because it hasn't been killed properly. So we're in a sort of race against time. There are these there's a race going on between the enzymes and the bacteria. And bacteria, if they win the race, they're going to decompose that animal. That animal is going to rot before the enzymes can actually soften the muscle tissue and improve the flavor. And so we have to eat seafood very fresh, because if we don't, it's going to decompose on us. It's going to smell. It's going to offend us. And I would argue that there's been an entire generation of Americans that have been traumatized by their seafood in the past. And so the way that we respond to that is to eat seafood very defensively. We want to eat it as quickly as possible. We want to eat it as fresh as possible, because we're worried that it's going to smell and it's going to stink up our kitchens, and it's going to, it's going to traumatize the next generation. We think of it as an adult food. It's not something that kids eat, but
Right.
that's really wrong-headed, because especially wild fish, just like other wild animals, they are so nutrient dense that to preclude children from eating that is insanity. Um, your children should be eating the most nutrient dense foods, but unfortunately, we have a lot of bad practices in our history that have really given fish a bad name. And so we tend to eat fish and seafood defensively because we're scared of the smell and we're scared of the taste, and we should be if it's not handled properly, which is, I think, where sushi comes in. And so sushi is this, it's a flex. It's a chef's flex. So sushi is a way to demonstrate how perfect this fish is. And a lot of people, especially in the US, have this misconception that sushi is really fresh, and that's why it doesn't smell, and that's why it doesn't taste fishy. But that's wrong, for all the reasons I just explained. Sushi, actually, in its highest form, is very aged. In some cases, the tuna is 6 months old, for exactly the same reason that you want to eat a dry aged 6 month old steak. You want to give it that time to soften, and you want to give it that time to improve its glutamic acid and isinoxalic acid content to make it very, very savory. I see a lot of pictures of, like, fishing bros out there that are showing off how fresh their tuna is by eating it on the boat, and they're just bathing this thing in soy sauce, and I can promise you that they're not tasting the fish, because the fish doesn't have a taste. At that point, it is flavorless. What they're tasting is soy sauce, and they're associating the flavor of sushi with soy sauce, but not the fish. The
Right.
fish, just like the elk that's green, will not actually have developed that flavor that it needs yet. So what
So real
EKG makes,
quick, we,
right?
we know how like a cow or a pig or an elk now dries, and we're familiar with that. But once we get the fish off the boat, and let's obviously this is in Japan, since we're talking about sushi, and it's been harvested through this Ike Jime process. How does it go through the process of this 3 to 6 months? Is it flash frozen? Where is this fish as it goes through this process?
Yeah, well, to be clear, I mean, the 6 month aging process really kind of applies to, like, big tuna species. Um, you can and should age your fish to let it sort of mature, even small fish, but we're not looking at, a 6 month scope, but maybe something more like a few days. Like if
Okay.
you're talking about a flounder or a flatfish, or halibut or something, right? It depends on how big it is. Um, to answer your question, a lot of those pelagic species are flash frozen, which is another conversation. But that's largely to manage parasite risks, but it's also to engage in some seafood arbitrage. But
Isn't
um,
all sushi been flash frozen?
no,
Okay.
um, because first of all, it depends on, like, sushi isn't a species. So there's a lot of different species that are implicated in a sushi menu. Um, I think categorically tuna will be frozen. Salmon and a lot of other farmed fish are not frozen.
Got it.
Um, they need not be, um, as a legal matter. Um, some fish are just inappropriate for sushi, because there's just too many unavoidable parasites. So, for example, wild salmon should really never be consumed raw. But all of the salmon that's on a sushi menu, that's all farmed salmon. So they're generally devoid of the parasite risk. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think what I was getting to is there's a lot of people who, especially in the sushi world, associate freshness with never being frozen before. But in our
Mm.
last conversation, we were discussing that, and a lot of people, I think, although do venture out into the salmons and some of the other things, when people go have sushi, if they get away from the crab roll or something like that, they do eat a lot of tuna, and they associate the tuna with being never frozen, super fresh, came off the boat, may have arrived in days, right? And that's one of the things that's just not true.
Yeah, well, certainly for tuna, they have absolutely been frozen.
Right.
Um, but the deep freezing is a very different type of freezing. So, like if in my home freezer, I cannot deep freeze because my freezer is too warm. So I can freeze something, but the speed at which it will freeze is very slow. And so when you freeze things at high temperatures, like in a home freezer, ice crystals form. So this is just the physical properties of water. So as ice crystals form inside muscle tissue, i.e., inside muscle cells, the crystalline formation will burst cell walls. It'll literally like sever them. And that's a problem because you're going to lose all your water. So even though it may freeze, when it thaws, you're going to have something called thaw drip or drip loss. So when it actually thaws out again, it's awful. I mean, you're
Hmm.
just left with a dry, terrible piece of muscle tissue, but that's because the ice crystal formation has ruined it. Flash freezing, on the other hand, doesn't permit the formation of ice crystals. So it will all just freeze very quickly and then it will thaw and it's like nothing ever really happened. So that's kind of the difference between flash freezing and conventional freezing. If we all could have medical grade freezers in our home, great. We cannot. And
So what does
so,
the standard angler do that wants to preserve his fish in that manner? Is he just kind of SOL?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I have provocative things to say about that a lot of people aren't going to want to hear. Um, the first thing is that, to the extent possible, try to leave the fish as whole and intact as possible. So that's obviously going to differ by species. It's easier to, leave a small trout whole and intact than it may be a 400-pound tuna,
Right.
especially if you're a recreational angler and you're trying to keep it in your home fridge. um, I would think about it as a piece of fruit. So if you were to store an apple, you don't want to peel it and quarter it and then put it in a fridge in a plastic bag. Instead, what you want to do is you want to take the whole apple, leave it in your fridge, and then when it's time to eat the apple, then you cut it. Because you're at that point, at the moment of consumption, that's when it's being exposed to air, it's oxidizing, it's exposed to, whatever's around. No problem, but it's still very intact. A steak is fine, but like if you might have to trim the pellicle, right? So really practically speaking, what I tend to see folks, especially recreational and sports anglers do, is they'll whack the fillet really early. So as soon as they're back on land, whack a fillet, throw it in a Ziploc bag, and pray. That Ziploc bag is basically a biohazard. So there's enough water accumulating in there, and that water is going to be a substrate for bacteria. That bacteria is going to proliferate. Some people are confused when the Ziploc bag is sort of turned into a balloon and it's inflating in their fridge, and that's because there's bacterial off-gassing. So it's actually inflating your Ziploc bag. So my strong recommendation is to the extent possible, try to keep the fish as whole or intact as possible first. Then it needs to be wrapped in some sort of absorbent material, like a paper towel. Then it needs to be placed into ideally an air-proof or oxygen-proof bag. And it just needs to be held in a constant temperature between, let's say, 3 and 10 degrees Celsius. So that's like 33 to 4, tops like 38 degrees Fahrenheit. If you can manage the moisture, so remember, like a lot of this is just sort of bacterial management, right?
Right.
So you want to deprive the bacteria of water. So that's why it needs to be in some sort of absorbent, has to have an absorbent layer. That's even if you have a whole fish. You want to deprive the bacteria of oxygen. So if you can use some sort of, either a vacuum sealer or even just like a straw in a Ziploc bag, try to take out as much air as you possibly can. You want to, keep it away from sunlight, and you want to keep it away from high temps. And that's pretty much going to allow you to let a fish or a cut of fish age in a very, very appropriate manner. If it's a big fish, you're going to need to, I think of it maybe like a wound, right? So you got to change the bandages. You can't just sort of let bandages get wet and start to fester. You're going to have to put on clean and dry bandages and keep it as disinfected as possible. And that's effectively what that's the environment you're trying to recreate in your home for these fish. It's a sterile environment. And you can go a very, very long time. So if you have, let's say, 18-inch brown trout, I know this is like sacrilege, but let's say you had an 18-inch brown trout that you had not, it didn't, it took the hook too deep, and you're just going to have to take it. So you can brain spike it, or you can bonk it, you can bleed it, and you can paralyze it, and you can take that fish, and ideally you want to eviscerate it, and you want to get it into the slush or the slurry as quickly as possible in a straight line until you can get it home. Once you're home, you want to dry that whole fish off as much as you possibly can. So wipe it down with a towel, wipe it down with a paper towel, whatever you need to do. Keep that fish dry, wrap it in paper towels, put it then into a bag, and leave it in your fridge. And that fish can ride. An 18-inch brown like that can probably, if you change the Band-Aids, you can get 2 weeks out of it, no problem. No problem. It does not need to be frozen, and it will improve in flavor. And so when it's time to eat it, that is the time to butcher it. But if you can hold off on like as soon as you fillet it, you've created this incredible amount of real estate for oxygen, sunlight, yeast, bacteria, water. All of that is exposed now. So the longer you can keep it intact, the better.
I like your apple analogy. I think people can resonate with that, right? You don't cut an apple till you're ready to eat. And those who have cut an apple before they're ready to eat and set in a bowl and walked away for a half hour, 45 minutes, came back and, had an apple that was beginning to brown. And the reason
Yep.
is because you've now exposed the apple has a skin, a protective skin over it, just like fish and other animals do. And as soon as you expose it to the bacteria, it's beginning, basically, essentially beginning to rot.
Yep. That's exactly right.
So this is amazing, and I think for the angler out there that truly is, bringing some fish home, these are just really simple techniques to make sure that you have the best fish possible. I think the other thing that has enlightened a lot of people is this idea of freshness. That bringing that fish home and cooking it the next day or that night, and I'm guilty of this. I'm guilty of this. We're having the freshest salmon possible, the freshest steelhead, because we just caught it this morning and it's on the grill and it just couldn't be any better. And in reality, it was, the garlic and all the stuff that we stuffed it with that probably ended up making it taste so good. So I think that this is really enlightening from the standpoint of, preserving the fish and creating something that's just going to be that much tastier. And that's those of us that keep fish, that's what we're doing. A reason that we're doing it for is obviously to eat it or entertain our friends, etc. But let's go back to, a conversation that you and I had that I think that people here are going to find really interesting. And you touched on a little bit, and that is, so this fish is basically coming in from Japan in large part, the fish that we're eating in a lot of the sushi restaurants. And today we're very familiar with, and what I'm going to get to is kind of the regulations that do and do not exist. Today in the United States, everybody's really familiar with the USDA. When they walk into Albertsons or into one of their grocery stores, there's a rating system on our beef that we're familiar with, prime, things like that. Walk us through a little bit about the rating system that doesn't or doesn't exist for this fish, and kind of when people walk into a store, the difference between what you're seeing on these beef packages versus fish.
Man, okay. So this is my favorite topic.
Good.
So in the American livestock industry, we have not only a federal statute, but also a federal statute that has delegated specific responsibility to a federal agency to oversee meat quality. Okay, so quality is an important word. That federal agency is the USDA. Animal care and welfare standards are enforced by the FSIS, which is the Food Safety and Inspection Service, I believe. So, as a consequence of having effectively a federal framework and regulatory infrastructure, we have 8 different grades of beef. And those 8 different grades have 8 different attending industries. So, for example, prime beef, a lot of that is going to restaurants and fine steakhouses. There's effectively a dog food category, and that, services pet food and Taco Bell. So we have these 8 different shields or 8 different grades of beef. And again, that's because we have a federal statute, federal regulations, and a federal agency to implement those regulations that give effect to these different quality grades. Seafood, on the other hand, does not have any such statute. What we have instead is the FD&C Act, which is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that has effectively deputized the FDA to regulate seafood. But the scope of authority for the FD&C Act is only so far as to regulate safety. So this is very interesting. So the FDA can only regulate seafood safety. There is no federal statute or agency to oversee seafood quality. So that means that the FDA is regulating seafood to the same standard as it would regulate chewing gum. It just needs to be safe. And my argument is that is a national economic tragedy. Because if you do not have any oversight of quality, then it's very hard to have a mature economy or industry. So, and I think that's particularly that's particularly dramatic in the U.S., where we have the second most biodiverse marine ecosystem on the planet. So we've got the live product here. It's just that we don't actually have a very robust framework for how we can commercialize amazing species, amazing food. And that's what we've been working hard to try to shore up. It's also complicated by the fact that we have 50 different states and territories. And so we have a federalism problem. We have a distinction between state water, federal water, international water. That can get a little messy as well. But at a minimum, what we need to start really grappling with is that we have a legal problem with the seafood industry. There's a legal issue here. And that legal issue needs to be solved in some way. It will be, some of it can be immediately solved by states separately from the federal government. Some of it needs to come from the federal government. But there is no seafood quality standards. So when people say something is sushi grade or sushi quality, that's not anything but marketing. That's not a real standard. That's not legally cognizable or enforceable. That's just a marketing word. People will equate it with like maybe being, I don't know, it depends on who you are, where you are. Sometimes people say sushi quality means that it's been pre-frozen. But also sushi quality can mean farmed salmon. Um, I think that's part of the problem, and I think that's given rise to even more seafood anxiety in this country. So if we've already sort of got a problem with people eating seafood defensively, we don't really have a great communication vehicle for people to understand like what is safe, what is quality. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of like scary things. So they say pregnant women shouldn't eat sushi. Well, why? What is it about sushi that is a danger to
Right.
pregnant women? People will say don't eat raw oysters. Why? What is the risk? So I think that there's unfortunately there's a lot of bad information out there. Some of it's actually issued by government. Sometimes it's very misleading, and that is the direct result of just not having a very robust regulatory framework that has deputized any state or federal agency with really telling the quality story of seafood. And so I think it's a void in our
So,
state and national economies.
from a consumer standpoint in the U.S., I mean, in theory, as we go to a seafood house, and have our grouper or halibut, or whatever, there's really no difference in that fish, presumably, than the fish that we're buying at Albertsons. There's no scale with which to gauge this on.
That's exactly right. Um, we also have like a seafood fraud problem, right? So that's not solved by an agency that's limited to really looking at safety, right? So these
Why is
frustrations.
this? Why do we have a process for pork, chicken, and beef, but we don't have a process? Because cows and pigs and chickens are also coming from all of these different states. Obviously, there's state and federal. That's probably not as big of issue. Could be with some of the sheep and lambs and different things like that graze on federal lands, but maybe how all that ties in. But why are these regulated and fish are not?
Well, um, it's a complicated question. I mean, I think part of it is cultural. So, this country was founded by cultures that really prioritize value animals as being large mammals like cows and pigs. If you go to an island like Japan, their value animal are big fish, right? I mean, so their
Of
version
course.
of a cow is a tuna.
Right.
Um, so there's just like, kind of different cultural pressures either way. Um, the the statute that sort of gave rise to livestock and meat production quality standards in the United States came about in 1958 on the heels of a lot of the hysteria around Upton Sinclair's books and a lot of public health outbreaks in the 1930s and 40s that were directly related to very poor practices in animal stockyards and slaughterhouses. So people were dying of some very preventable slaughterhouse contaminants and infections, and so they needed to do something about that, but they also needed to shore up international commodity markets. And one of the ways to do that is to standardize quality across the United States so that we could sell beef overseas, so that we could stabilize these proteins in a way that was consistent, that was reliable, and that was safe to move around the country and to make sure that we had not only food security in this country for our protein, because we had some rationing issues during World War II, but then also to be able to, move these products around as commodities. So there was, there's going to be political pressure there, there's going to be economic pressure there, because those are familiar proteins. It wasn't as common for Americans, at least in a lot of states, to really rely on seafood. I mean, seafood is something, at least at scale, that was, available to coastal states, um, and not necessarily a lot of inland states. So, and also our distribution chains are kind of centrally located. We go to the bread basket and from the center and distribute out a lot.
Right.
So I think it was like, just a lot of different accidents of history, and we're a young country. We've got lots of time to sort these things out and to figure out best practices and how to do things. We certainly did not begin the 20th century with very good practices for livestock. They were horrendous, but we got better. And I think the same is true with seafood. We, have historically not had great practices, but we need to modernize and we need to remain competitive. This is just my opinion. I
Yeah.
think we need to be willing to compete. We have to be able to compete with all of our products, and that includes seafood. And that kind of begins with just general knowledge. And the sports angler is really elemental in this conversation because sports anglers are uniquely positioned as people that have access to wild seafood. And um, I, I always joke that like sports anglers always take for granted how amazing their skill set is. So if you zoom way out and you think about just sort of the human experience in general, the idea that you can actually extract a living animal from a body of water, and that living animal is invisible to you at the surface, and you can actually do that repeatedly and with confidence, that is a crazy trick to have just as a human in the world, in the sort of
Yeah.
larger experience of humans, right? I mean, it is not an easy thing to do, and anglers always take that for granted. They forget. They're too, distracted with like, okay, what tippet size am I using, or Am I using weight forward floating line or what? I mean, it's like you get bogged down in these details and you have actually forgotten that you have this amazing talent to do something that most humans cannot do. And I want especially the sports community to take a step back and to understand that their access confers a responsibility. And that responsibility is to be able to articulate really the value of what these species are. Some of these fish that come out of the water that you're holding in your hand have never seen a real expression on a plate that does justice to how magnificent this animal is in the first place, right? By the time it gets to someone's plate, it's been stripped of its skin, it's been stripped of its face and its head. It's just this meat substitute. And then you blackened it with Walmart seasonings. And so at that point, you've taken this majestic creature that is just brilliant and bursting with color, and on the plate, it's lost all of its identity. And
That.
I'm not suggesting that that's intentional or that's like, stupid or anything, but I am suggesting that there is this opportunity now. There is this opening to say, okay, hold on. If I am going to take this, I am going to show the world that not only is this crazy trick that I have really valuable from just like a general skill set perspective,
Yeah.
I can actually explain and I can articulate a new vision of why this fish is not a farmed catfish, why this fish is not a farmed tilapia from sketchy waters in China. This is something very, very different. This is something very, very unique, and it needs and deserves to be distinguished even on the plate. Because if we don't, we cannot improve the value of this. And that falls, unfortunately, on the sports angling community, is to actually show people that, to give people that line of sight. The commercial fishers tend to not do a great job of that. But
I,
sports anglers have an outsized role to play.
I honestly, one of the reasons why really was compelled to do this podcast was I think it's accidental through ignorance. I would challenge how many sports fishermen honestly know the information that you've shared today. And what does happen to a fish as it goes through this process, and and how easy it could be to elevate it, change it slightly, because a lot of this stuff is happening. There is ice involved. There is a way of extinguishing this fish, and with a couple other steps, you change it from a like you said, there's eight quality from a dog food quality of a fish or close to it to prime by just a few of these. So in your opinion, how many sports fishermen are really educated on this idea that there is a way of creating a higher quality fish simply by handling it differently?
Um, I want to think it's more. It's not. Um, in general, like the sport fishing community tends to measure the value of a fish in what I call sort of bro terms. So the value is like, how big is it?
Right.
What kind of how big is this going to be after I stuff it and put it over my desk? Or, how could I show this off on Facebook or something, right? So the value proposition is just sort of vanity and entertainment. By contrast, the commercial fishermen, the value of the fish is measured in dollars. So it's literally like in discrete integers. And that is a binary that doesn't need to exist as as clearly as it is now. And again, I
Explain
think I'm sorry.
explain that.
So, I mean, I think that sport fishermen think I'm a sport fisherman. All I do is fish, and the value of the fish is entertainment, and that's it.
Right.
Eating is secondary. How to take care of it is secondary. I'm out here for the entertainment of it all, and that's it. And then the commercial fishermen is their position is, I'm not here for the entertainment. I'm here to get paid, and that's it.
Right. Okay. Yep.
And that binary, I think, is not necessary. Um, and I hope that we can try to change how hardened those two positions are, because actually it's a very symbiotic relationship between the recreational sport community and the commercial community. They're both actually chasing the same species, which is different than the land counterparts, right? Hunters are not after um, Angus cows. Like
Right.
they're very separate industries. But fishing, we're talking about like shared resources, and I
Great
know
point.
that there are more voices in the sport and recreational fishing communities, especially in the younger generations and the next generation, where they're asking really tough questions, right? Especially as a lot of these fisheries become less fishable, where there's less fish available. They're asking tough questions. They're like, what are we doing out here, right? Are we just kind of entertaining ourselves and whacking fillets and, um, just, is this just a vanity project, or is there a way for me to exercise some measure of marine stewardship by doing what I love to do, which is fishing? And the answer is you can absolutely do both. And one of the ways you can do that is by increasing the value of what you're catching. And you can do that even as a sport fisher or as a recreational angler by like sort of taking a step back and saying like, okay, let me just actually rethink this fish. A great example is like what happens here on the Chesapeake Bay. So you have a lot of folks that, we have a dwindling striped bass, or what we call rockfish in this area. We have a dwindling resource. And this population is just unfortunately not replacing itself in a potentially deleterious way for the entire eastern seaboard. So you got a lot of you have a generation of an older generation of fishermen that pretty much laid waste to that population. There's a lot of different factors, but the way to the tradition was get out there, trophy season, whack as many of these things as you can, take as many pictures as you can. Um, the commercial industry was catch as many as you can, and what we're going to do is we're going to sell these things as meat substitutes, where you just you whack the fillets, you take off the skin, you take off the head, and pan fry it with Walmart seasoning and butter, and there you go. The problem with that is that no one stopped to say, okay, what is different about that striped bass from a farmed catfish when it comes to the plate? Because that is where the value is going to be set. So if you're not able to distinguish the characteristics of a wild striped bass from its farmed catfish counterpart at the plate, that value will not trickle down back into the water. And so I think there has been a reckoning, and the next generation, the younger generation of sports and recreational anglers here on the bay are like, okay, hold on, maybe we don't need to just get out there and start whacking striped bass in a way that's, not really, we're not benefiting a great deal from that, right? If we're totally depleting this resource and we're not conserving it, and then if we eat it, I mean, are we like, is it a better product than a farmed catfish? Not really.
Right.
And so I do think I feel very heartened by the newer approaches from these next generations that are like, all right, when I eat, I want to eat a little bit more responsibly. So how do I do that? And they're learning more and they're asking more questions. They're asking harder questions. And a lot of these questions are not being answered in a very um, good way by the older generation. That we're just living in a different ecosystem now. The abundance is not here. And so we just have to sort of, shift realities and maybe rethink what our habits are and what our favorite ways are. If your favorite way is to get out there and just start indiscriminately whacking as many rockfish as you possibly can, just like your granddad did. Newsflash, like that's just not available. That's just, we don't have that ecosystem anymore. Um, and I think the next generation knows that. They're extremely inquisitive. They're extremely invested in sort of these larger environmental concerns that may actually begin with some of these attitudes about whether fishing is simply entertainment and that's it, or if it's simply commercial and that's it. But actually, maybe we actually have some shared purposes here and a shared future for the ecosystem that we all kind of need, maybe in our own ways, but we've got to kind of get correct with how it is that we're going to think about these things now, especially in the context of limited resources and dwindling populations. So, to answer your question, I think that the question about how anglers, like where they're at, I think it depends on the generation. I think
Yeah.
older anglers have like, a certain worldview that they're accustomed to. And I think, like my kids' generation, they're thinking about things really differently than I'm thinking about it. And I hope everyone can not be sort of fastened to a certain way, but actually just like have really like realistic conversations about what's true and not, not take anything personally and chew and not swallow,
Right.
maybe.
So from I just have a couple things I'd like to tie into this, and that is the person that's going out to enjoy food, seafood today, whether they're buying that at the local store or whether they're at the restaurant. Is there any way of them determining the quality of fish that they are consuming, or is it literally just a complete crapshoot?
The short answer is no.
No, there is no way of knowing.
Correct. There is no way of knowing. So if I go into a Safeway and I look at these exposed fillets, now you know my prejudice about fillets,
Yeah,
right? This
totally. Yeah, yeah.
all the surface area just out there. If I
For
go into a
multiple
safe,
days.
yeah, for multiple days. If I go into a Safeway and I see those fish out on display, and I go into a Whole Foods and I see those fish out on display, there's nothing. There's no meaningful indicator that's either reliable, standardized, or reasonable to tell me whether or not these one fish is higher quote unquote quality than the other. Like, there is none.
Right. Just
There
because it's
is
on Whole Foods roof and is costing you an extra $5 a pound does not mean that it is a higher quality at all.
100%. And also, maybe we should talk about what quality means, right? So, what is quality? Like, in my mind, it could be quote unquote Ike Jime quality, crazy fresh, aged, I don't care, like whatever. Um, and if you gave me the option to eat that versus a wild Ike quality, Ike fish, I'm going to take that Ike the wild one, all day. Because in my mind, quality is nutritional density as well, right? So yes, like we have these sort of Ike things like about muscle acidity and gaping and whatever. But when I think about quality, it's not just does it taste good or does it look good or all that stuff. It's like it's also these wild species at this point, sort of in the course of the American food system, a wild fish or a wild animals, they are nutritional superfoods. I
Right.
mean, unfortunately, that's where we're at. I mean, I don't know that that was always the case, but that's kind of where we're at now. And so the opportunity to eat these incredible animals that are wild is kind of getting further and further away from us. So I know that there is extreme opportunity for Americans to finally have some opportunity to eat wild caught Ikejime quality fish that can be maintained and stored over extended periods of time if we wanted to. Um, and we want to, I'm just not sure if folks know that it's even possible. We tend to sort of give up and we say, well, the best stuff is from overseas, right? The best fish is from Japan, the best fish is from Greece, or it's from Central America, or it's from a farm. And that's just not the case. Yes, it can be a very complicated matter. So, we've got to take into account things like heavy metals, parasites, maybe refrigeration protocols, EKG not EKG whatever. But I do believe that like it's possible in this country, excuse me, in this country, to bring some sanity and some standardization and meaningful information to the general American consumer. Um, it's going to take a little while, but in the meantime, what I tell sports anglers and recreational anglers is that the value of Ike Jime quality fish actually has not been priced into the market yet in the US. It kind of has in certain restaurants.
Where do you find a Jime fish? I mean, obviously, I hang out in Idaho and Montana, and so maybe we don't see this as much. But are there restaurants that have that designation today where you are eating an Ike Jime
Yeah, well,
fish?
they don't have a designation because it's pro forma in a lot of the restaurants that are bringing fish from Japan. And those are not limited, by the way, to sushi restaurants. So there are plenty of Michelin-starred fine dining restaurants that are Greek and Italian and French that will discriminate against American domestically harvested fish and ship in fish by FedEx from Japan to create French applications. I mean, that is the level of quality. So it's literally coming all the way from Japan in better shape, unfrozen, than they could otherwise source from South Carolina. I mean, that is the insanity of it all.
Right.
But so, your average person in Montana and Colorado and, other parts of the middle of the country, in general, like unless it's coming in from overseas, you're not going to be able to purchase that on the open market. But as I tell folks, if that's the case, then really the only way right now to get that quality is to get it yourself. And that is a privilege of the skilled hands of sports anglers.
Right.
Back to this
Like
human
that.
trick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can actually, right now, for yourself and your family and your friends, create a product that is right now actually priceless because it hasn't been priced into the market. It has no price yet. So the opportunity for someone in, I don't know, the Gallatin River in Montana to, if they need to harvest a brown and have an EKG quality brown, that is not priced in. That is a priceless fish right now. That level of quality cannot be purchased, but it can be had if you are an angler.
Yeah. Well said. Which
Yeah.
leads me to my other question that I have. You actually have this kit, this that can be purchased that anglers, whether you're the angler out there salmon fishing or some of these sport fishermen guys that actually do this recreationally, but on a consistent basis. Tell us a little bit about this kit and where someone might go get it instead of their bat. If they were going to replace their bat and pocket knife, where would they go get this?
Yeah. So, well, one of the things that, like, when we first started, we noticed that there are no like purpose built tools for American anglers to use, let alone learn on. So there was an option. I mean, this is like over 10 years ago, but um, even if you were able to source some of these tools from Asia, they were not keyed to American species. So yeah, maybe it works on like fish in Japan, but it didn't translate into the American fishing experience. And we wanted folks, especially commercial folks, to at least understand how they could learn so that they themselves could prove concept, even if only to satisfy their own curiosity. So, in the absence of that, we started actually just manufacturing these tools for the commercial community. And they are not slick. They are just, these commercial grade tools. They are sized to different species. Um, so if you're like in the salmon category, like let's say up to about 30 inches, we have uh, an orange colored Shinke wire that's appropriately sized for a fish of that length. Um, if you're in the offshore category, um, we have different wires for like larger class tunas. Um, we have what we call like a river and stream set, and that's for very small, uh, smaller species. Interestingly, like a black sea bass actually has a very tiny neural canal, and you need that one with a very thin diameter wire. So we sell our products on our website in the pro shop. The website is www.ikejimefederation.com. You can also purchase our tools through AFTCO, the American Fishing and Tackle Company. I don't want to overstate the level of technology that we've applied to these tools. So, unfortunately, they are just, kind of commercial grade stuff. We have not modified our stuff for like the sport fishing market. Sport fishing market is just unfortunately going to get the exact same stuff that the commercial market's going to get. But I hope folks will at least appreciate that in spite of the lack of technology, it's not software. These are not AI enabled devices. Folks can at least understand that what we wanted folks to do with our tools is sort of put away this idea that you always need to, and I know that this is a special, as an angler, I get it. We don't always need to like DIY and sort of hack our way through fishing gear, especially when it comes to stuff for our food. So I know that it is absolutely, absolutely possible, and I get this feedback all the time. Well, I just use a sharpened screwdriver. I'm like, hey, that'll work. I have no objections to that. I'd rather you use a sharpened screwdriver than let the animal suffocate to death if you're going to eat it. But I hope folks will understand that what we're trying to bridge here is the connection between the fishing and the food. And so a sharpened screwdriver will work. And so if folks want to use that, no problem. Problem with screwdrivers is they're made of tooling steel, and tooling steel rusts very quickly. And we don't put rusty stuff in our food. That's it. So we're not giving you high tech, but we're giving you like stuff that's food grade, right?
Right.
So we just hope that folks will, if folks want to, try out titanium leader wire or whatever, like no problem. But to the extent you just need like actual equipment that's just like purpose built, I'd encourage folks to use real equipment. And make that determination at that point and not say, well, this doesn't work because they've got faulty stuff or they've got like some kind of wire that's going to buckle or kink or something before it can actually work.
I personally, at least from my standpoint, I don't see the issue being that I would rather DIY myself through this than buying a kit. It's that I don't know that the
Mm.
benefit of using this. I really do. I don't think it has anything to do with someone saying, "Well, I would rather use this wire and this screwdriver to do it." I believe the person using the screwdriver has no idea that he's performing an Ike Jime technique. What he is doing is dispatching the fish in a humane manner that his grandpa taught him. My grandpa
Hmm.
taught me to pull out my rusty pocket knife and to put a little incision in the fish's brain, disconnecting it from feeling the continued suffocation that I allowed because or we banged it on the head and then we threw it in the cooler. So I used those techniques not because I was a DIY or I didn't know about this. I didn't know that I could go online and buy these tools because I would argue that the anglers I hang out with do not DIY their way through things. They have the top of the technology, they have the best of the best. And if they knew that this inexpensive thing could be purchased and put into their tool bag, because I've seen it, it's not cumbersome, it's super easy to have in your boat or in your bag. I think this is an education thing, 100%.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that that's what folks take from our products. I don't um, we're not like a tech company. Um, I think if anything, I hope that what our products allow people to feel is a sense of empowerment over the quality of the food that they're going to take home, the food that they're going to be able to share, and the opportunity to rethink their relationship with the fish that they're going to keep. Um, I don't use terms like humane or suffering because you can't measure that, but you can measure stress. You can measure muscle acidity. You can measure cortisol. So we
Right.
know certain things. And so, you know, if I just hope that folks know that, don't take my word for it. Um, the product quality speaks for itself. If you can just sort of practice a little bit, it is not something that you pick up immediately, right? You will need to practice some of these skills a little bit. But if you're an angler and you're tying
Constantly. Yeah.
FG
Yeah.
knots and
Yeah.
you're messing around with these tiny little 24x hooks and stuff, you're gonna figure it out. I mean, that fishing is a self-selecting sport,
Well,
and
I look a lot of it at this like hunting, and educating because back in the day when I learned to hunt, it wasn't just my dad, my grandpa, and the people. Everybody harvested a deer, left or an elk, left the hide on. You split the chest cavity, you shoved a stick in there so that it would cool through the night, and
yep.
we all ate that. And yeah, nobody really liked mule deer, but you ate it, and people said they like elk. We didn't have a comparison until somebody said, try it this way. I took the hide off my elk. I
Mm.
hung it. I cut it up. I did these things. Taste this. And we all said, wow, it's so much we could do that. All I needed to do was take the hide off the animal while I was in. I'm going to do that next time. And then we started seeing these different techniques, and now we have game bags and all of these things that have come, and it's through a form of being educated. Because if I'm going to take the time and energy to fill my boat up with gas or fill my truck up with gas, climb a mountain or catch this fish, I do want to honor it. So again, I don't think it's the angler saying, I don't really care. I just want to throw it in the cooler. I think quite the contrary. If an angler is out there to harvest their fish for consumption, I would certainly want to know this as someone who was, out there. I've got my fillet table and my knife, and I've got my free. I do care. I have the technology to take this fish from the water to my freezer. And what you're educating us on is that there's a process that can take place that will absolutely. I mean, you can use the word honor, but really, it's a way of taking this fish and elevating the flavor and the nutrient base that's in that fish, which is really what we're wanting to do anyway. We eat fish because it's nutritious and we eat it because it's flavorful. We don't know today that it could be more flavorful because we haven't tasted it.
Yeah, I'll react to something. I mean, I I really appreciate you using this word honor because I think it's part of the conversation that people don't want to have, even though they feel it. So I think there's a lot of, especially in the hook and bullet crowd, they feel that honor, but they don't always like talking about it. Um, And, I've had some interactions with especially charter captains recently that, they grew up fishing certain water. And um, this one guy comes to mind, and just this mountain of a man, and he was almost on the verge of tears, and he said to me, like, he said, "Thank you for finally giving me a way to not have to club these fish to death on a boat in front of my customers, to listen to it kick and buck underneath, in a cooler underneath my clients' butts on the boat. Like, I treasure these animals. I treasure these waters that I fished. I grew up here, and I don't want to do it my old way anymore. I want to honor these animals. This is
Right.
my life. This is my livelihood." And when he said that to me, I was like, man, that means so much, right? Because he's honoring himself in that as well.
Right.
And so I really appreciate that comment. I mean, I just think that, people feel it. They just don't want to talk about it as much. I mean, it's just not something that the hook and bullet crowd is as comfortable
Well, I think
talking
you
about.
mentioned it. It's
That's
cultural based. You guys honor probably your fish. Like over in Japan, they probably honor a large tuna fish at a different level. You see a lot of big game hunters, praying over their kill. Honoring that animal, wanting to, put a quick kill on it, an
Mhm.
ethical kill. We talk about the distance of shots that we're going to take, position that
Yep.
the animal should be standing when we take it. We give each other a hard time if it's the two shots too far or taking it the wrong angle, and so there is a level of standard that we want our animals taken. And for many of us, not all of us, but that's just society, do honor our kills today. I don't think that
Mhm.
happens as much as maybe upland birds or ducks per se, but there is a whole um, kind of a different level of feeling when it comes to. And I think maybe it's because you're looking at that animal as more of a consistent source of nutritional value throughout a season. Maybe that comes from generations back where it was a must to get a couple deer and an elk in the freezer and you really, it was kind of life or death versus having a couple of ducks, or some upland birds in there. But I really see that all of that really came through education. And I think that through this, you getting the word out, some podcasts like this, where people just have a better understanding of how we honor the fish, is taking it from this amazing, pristine, environment that we all enjoy hanging out with to our table, and making it as tasty as possible. And part of that is, the honoring process, not just the harvesting and the execution of that animal in a humane way that you don't use that word, but it's a more humane way of exterminating that animal. But the whole education on how you can make that fish taste so much better, and that's a form of honoring it, I think people will resonate with. I really do. It's just about getting the word out there, and then
Yeah.
using tools as a byproduct of it, because just like the all of the tools they use in order to harvest that animal, it's you know the best of the best in many instances, and this is just an extension of that.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I hope that folks will give it a give it a shot and see what happens. And like I say, the product will speak for itself. It will taste so much better, and it will taste better over time as well, right? So, the opportunity to not have to waste it. So if it's going, if you feel like it's a ticking time bomb, which is what a lot of people think when they're bringing their fish home. They're like, I've got 2 days and I
Yeah,
got to throw it in
yeah,
the flash.
yeah.
If it's not a ticking time bomb, and in fact, you got plenty of room. Um, and also, if you're going to share it with people, right? You're not like, look, you got 2 days to eat this, or else you got to throw it out. And I don't want any responsibility for what happens to you. That's a very different world than where we could go, which is, I'm going to give you a product that is amazing. It was ethically harvested. You've got time. You want to do it next week? Eat it next week. It'll be great. In fact, it'll be better next week.
Well, yeah, in theory, it'll be
Uh,
better. Right.
right. So enjoy it. We'll all celebrate together. And I can share with you without you feeling like you're in a race against time and otherwise you got to waste this life. So I hope folks will give it a shot and experience like how absolutely profoundly different these products can be with just a little bit of accountability, a little bit of skill, and some simple tools.
The last thing I want to touch on quickly is this podcast is getting long, but I think it's amazing. Is there's a lot of people that are going to be listening to this that want to understand what's the future look like. Your organization is out there right now, really trying to bring a rating standard to fish, correct? Like we have on the beef side of things. Quickly tell us a little bit about that and how the general public can get behind supporting some of this so that we do know that the fish that we go into a restaurant or to Albertsons or Safeway is of a certain quality and not just all the same.
Yeah, so the mission of the Ike Jime Federation is very simple. Um, in the absence of federal or state action to bring some clarity or to bring some level of quality to domestically harvested products, um, we will do it. And the way we will do it is by creating a system of accountability. I think everyone has heard about sustainable seafood or traceable seafood, which for reasons that maybe now be dead, we've kicked to death, doesn't actually tell you if it's high quality.
Right.
So we believe that quality is a function of action, of skill, and of handling ability. So the Ike Jime Federation is first and foremost designed to set standards. So, like unimpeachable scientific standards about quality and then how to reach them. And then we will certify stakeholders in the commercial seafood industry to be accountable to those standards. And that means tested. So if you are
Great.
certified, if you are a producer that is certified with the Ike Jime Federation, then what you are able to produce is a level of quality. But what ends up happening over time is variable, right? So if you want if you want to sell it to a chef and the chef buys it, well, look, whatever the chef wants to do with that, they want to age it for 21 days, they want to cook it that night. That's up to them.
Right.
But this level of quality can actually perform in a wide variety of settings. So whether it's going to be used in a sushi setting or it's going to be used in a Louisiana blackened setting, it doesn't matter. Quality is quality. So as I always joke with people, I don't care if you want to eat it raw, cook it, roll it up in papers and smoke it. What you're talking about is a grade of product that we just haven't seen in this country at scale before. So our approach is to certify the handlers by training them and establishing a system of accountability for that new quality standard in this country.
It's exciting, man. It really is. I think it's going to catch on really quick. I mean, I think that it'll take time, like anything, that education process. But you know, whether you're a hunter and gatherer mentality or just the person who likes to go out and enjoy a quality meal, I think the biggest thing that I took away from our last meeting was that how I walked around in this world, whether it's at a sushi restaurant or a nice seafood restaurant or an Albertsons, just kind of ignorant to the fact that there is no rating scale here. There is no regulations. This is just all the same, and who knows where it came from, how it came, and how it was harvested flash frozen, put in a standard freezer, and slow frozen. It's just a I mean, kind of like the wild, wild west in the fish market. So I really appreciate the education, because honestly, there's so much of this I had no idea, and I really, really appreciate that. And since our first meeting, I do look at fish differently, and was recently up in Canada harvesting, king salmon and halibut and lingcod, and we were having this exact conversation about how you um, just put some integrity, like you said, into this whole fishing thing, because yeah, a lot of times you can hear those fish kicking in the cooler, and there's a lot of men and particularly women who enjoy the sport of fishing but don't really want to be a part of the blood and guts aspect of it. So you really, really educated me on what wasn't, in place, and then the possibilities. And also, I really appreciated this idea of, you know, what is the definition of quality? Because it's not freshness, right? We hear like, if it's fresh, it's high quality. It just came out of the river. It's on the barbecue. It couldn't get any better. And the reality of it is that that's just something that's been put in our brain and is 100% not true. And I think that's also funny. We've all been running around kind of equating that, when in reality, it's the same as it is with our beef. The longer it's hung, the more flavorful it is, and the more of these, like you're saying, these processes can take place, which enhance the flavor. And the same goes for fish. We just don't know that. So I really appreciate you being on this, Andrew, and really educating myself and the listeners, because those that have listened to this, I guarantee, are going, wow, I really never thought about it in these terms. And I think the more we get people educated on this, the more support you're going to have. So thank you very much. And I do hope that the listeners out here share this, because that is how we're going to get people educated on how things are today, and some of the initiatives that you and your group have. So thanks a lot, man. You really know your stuff inside and out. And that's the other thing I really appreciate. A lot of people talk about stuff and they kind of talk about it from a high elevation and never, can't really get down into the details. And you most certainly can. And I really appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate it. You flatter me, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I'd like to do is maybe next year bring you back on to talk a little bit about how this process has been coming along, that the educating and getting the anglers kind of, not only the anglers, but also the consumers, better educated up on what's possible in the realm of quality.
Well, I'll do you one better. How about next year? I'll come out to visit you, and I will bring you fish from a part of the country that you could not get fish from since the inception of this country.
Let's do that. That really would be amazing. Yeah, and
Let's
really to be able to taste the difference, that'd be great.
let's eat.
Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. Great.
Andrew, want to real quick again, where can we tell us the website where we can buy your equipment?
Sure. It's Ike Jime Federation.com.
Better
And
spell
just
that for us.
it's IKEJIM as in Mary E Federation.com. You just go into our pro shop, and you can, buy tools individually, or you can buy kits. It's up to you. I'll share a discount code for you later.
Cool.
Um, or after
Thank
that. You can call it back in. And you can also purchase our equipment through AFCO,
Okay.
which is the American Fishing and Tackle Company. And you can, depending on where you are in this country, you can get it in tackle shops as well.
Great. Andrew, again, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this, and really appreciate you. Look forward to next year.
My pleasure. Let's eat some fish together.
And everybody listening today, thank you so much. Again, we can't tell you how much we appreciate you taking the time to tune into this. And again, like I asked, please share it with your fellow anglers out there. Let's help Andrew get people educated up. Thank you guys once again. We really appreciate you.